Light came along with a popular price.
Excuse me. I say, old chap, a cold bottle of Stroh's, please.
Did you know that one bad move can ruin a multi-billion-dollar empire? Well, that's exactly what happened to Schlitz after a crazy ad. And over time, other big brands have made mistakes that made them lose to their competition. Let's check out 20 vintage beer brands that we all miss.
You want to take away my Schlitz? You want to take away my gusto? You're the first person that ever made me laugh.
Schlitz. Once upon a time, Schlitz was the king of beer brands, holding the title of America's largest brewer in the first half of the 20th century. It was the beer that made Milwaukee famous. People loved it, but things changed after a string of bad decisions. In the 70s, they tried to cut corners by speeding up brewing, replacing malted barley with corn syrup, and added silica gel to prevent haze. And the result would be shocking. It tasted like something that was made in a hurry, and sales dropped. In 1976, they had to recall over 10 million bottles, like throwing away $6.3 million in a day. Desperate to fix things, they launched a weird ad campaign featuring a boxer and lumberjack with a pet cougar. The tagline said, "If you don't have Schlitz, you don't have gusto," leaving viewers unimpressed and confused. It was so bad they had to take it down, and the beer brand is nowhere to be found today. Piel's. Piel's was a classic beer brand in New England that was king for nearly 70 years, but competition soon threatened their brand, and so they came up with a brilliant marketing idea. Animated brothers Harry and Bert Piel were voiced by the comedy duo of Bob and Ray. People loved the ad and the characters, and viewers would listen to their TV just to watch the commercial.
That's how I describe Piel's. It's a good drinking beer.
Sales skyrocketed from 1955 to 1960, but would the fame last forever? Despite the popularity of the ads, they did not help the taste of the beer. Sales continued to drop. They had good marketing, but a seemingly bad product. Piel's had been around for decades but could not compete with other established brands, and eventually the brewery was sold. Ballantine Ale. If you're a fan of beer, you know about Ballantine Ale. The beer was founded in 1840 in New Jersey, and after Prohibition, sales would soar. It became the first ever sponsor of the New York Yankees, which helped them move it to reach the top 3 in U.S. beer sales. But as time went on, things became sour. By the mid-60s, it began losing ground to lighter beers with less alcohol, and despite every effort to revive it, the company gave up and sold the company. As expected, the new company wanted to try something new, and so they ditched the original recipe, and the charm would fade. The once beloved beer became a memory in the world of discontinued brands. Falstaff. Falstaff is a beer with a rich history in St. Louis, once competing with Anheuser-Busch. It was introduced before Prohibition and named after the Shakespearean character of Sir John Falstaff. It aggressively expanded and bought defunct breweries across the country, but the strategy was not the best. They couldn't compete with Budweiser and their expanding empire, and they decided to close by 1977. Even after their decline, the legacy still lived on in the city. Their battle with Anheuser-Busch may have ended in defeat, but they remain an important part of St. Louis brewing history. Old Style. Imagine brewing a beer with a secret technique that gives your brand a rich and complex flavor. That's what Old Style did. Created in 1900, they used an old-school fermentation process. It was like adding yeast to boost fermentation. The method produced a smooth beer, making Old Style a gem amongst brands. But they didn't only start with the name. They were originally called Golden Leaf and later switched to Old Times Lager. In 1902, they renamed it to Old Style, and by 1910, it was sold in over 30 states. Like many great things in history, it was hit by Prohibition, and they began brewing beer with less than 0.5% alcohol. It didn't do well with consumers, but they kept the lights on until the good days returned. Today, this iconic beer is nostalgic for all of those who remember it. Hamm's. This beer was a true Minnesota icon, a brand that began as the Excelsior Brewery in St. Paul, eventually becoming the Hamm Brewing Company. Theodore Hamm built the business with a strong vision, and in 1886 it became the second largest brewery in Minnesota. After Hamm's death in 1903, the family continued the company, surviving Prohibition. It bounced back after the Second World War and in the 50s made its mark thanks to the famous animated Hamm's beer commercials. Drinkers loved it and made Hamm's a household name. But as time went on, they struggled to stay afloat, and in 1968 were acquired by another company and then sold off in 1975. Blatz. The Blatz Brewing Company was once a mighty Milwaukee brand with a history as rich as its brews. Founded in 1851, they rose to become an innovator in the industry. The first Milwaukee brewery to establish a bottling department, their bottled beer would win top honors at the 1876 Centennial Exposition. By the 1880s, they were churning out over 100,000 barrels a year, and they took advantage of Milwaukee's proximity to the Chicago market. Like old brands, Blatz faced many challenges, like the failed merger attempt with Pabst and Schlitz. However, it did continue to thrive, surviving Prohibition by producing soda and malt syrup in the 1940s. They created catchy TV ads like the Amos and Andy Show, and despite efforts, they couldn't keep up with competition and closed their doors in 1959. National Bohemian. Natty Bo was once the pride of Baltimore, and if you'd ever been to Memorial Stadium, you would know it was the beer of the Orioles. You could hear the slogan, "Land of Pleasant Living," in every corner of Baltimore, and it felt like Natty Bo was everywhere. It was on your television, at the ballpark, and even in your grandfather's backyard. But as the 70s rolled in, things would change. National Bohemian merged with Canadian brewer Carling, and it closed in 1978 with production moving elsewhere. By the 90s, it had been sold to Pabst, who tried to change the recipe, but in 2009 they turned to the original. Bars eventually began selling the real Natty Bo in 2011, and everyone raised their glass to the beer that they had once loved. Stroh's. Stroh's was once a giant in the Midwest, growing from a small Detroit operation into a national powerhouse. The business was simple for nearly a century. Respect your customers and your employees. Sales would skyrocket in the 1950s, with production jumping from 500,000 barrels to 2.7 million. John Stroh led the company during the boom and knew every employee by name. That's how much of a relationship that he built. But the 1980s saw several acquisitions from other companies, and the deal nearly made them go bankrupt. Stroh's kept on going, suddenly becoming the third largest brewer, but then missed out on the light beer trend. They couldn't keep up due to a mountain of debt and stiff competition, and eventually gave way to other beer brands. Schmidt Beer. Schmidt Beer was founded in 1855 and made a name for itself as one of the first to bottle its beer and ship it to Memphis. The brewery became the largest in Minnesota, but after the founder died, it changed hands for good. Schmidt saw an opportunity and bought the St. Paul Brewing Company, renaming it the Jacob Schmidt Brewing Company to suit his needs. He renovated and gave it a medieval castle look. They produced a stronger version of the beer, and the brewery's fortunes would soar. By 1935, it became the seventh largest in the United States. After a series of ownership changes, Schmidt lost touch with customers and sold the company in the 1950s. Carling Black Label. Popular brands like Carling hold a special place in beer history. Founded in 1818 in Canada, it quickly became the favorite in the Great White North. Not long after, it expanded to the UK, and after Prohibition, they made a big move to the US. But it was only the beginning. In 1956, they expanded further, building the largest brewery in New England, and locals were excited to welcome America's most modern brew. This new brewery produced 1.2 million barrels of Red Cap Ale and Black Label beer, and it had the famous slogan, "Hey Mabel, Black Label." You could hear it everywhere you went. Carling even offered free brewery tours in the summer, but sadly closed in 1975. Olympia Beer. Olympia was a staple of the Pacific Northwest, later becoming a brand that vanished into beer history. It had a slogan that was impossible to forget: "It's the water." People loved the simple slogan because the beer was brewed in Washington, where waters made every sip feel like magic. After the brewery closed, things took a nosedive. Owners came and went, and Pabst took over in '99, moving production to California. The special water became a distant memory, and it no longer had a connection to the place where it was born. Eventually, Olympia tried to make a comeback, but things did not go as planned. Rheingold. After Prohibition had ended in 1933, Rheingold was launched. Named after the legendary opera Das Rheingold, the beer soon became a local favorite in New York. So popular with the launching of the Miss Rheingold contest. From 1940 to 1965, New Yorkers voted for their local beauty queen, and the winner became the face of the brand. Aside from being a popular beer, they looked forward to the contest, and by the 50s, Rheingold had 35% market share, making it the beer of choice. With the rise of mega breweries like Anheuser-Busch, they couldn't keep up, and in 1963 they'd be sold to Pepsi, and by 1978 the brand had disappeared. Iron City Beer. Iron City Beer is a true Pittsburgh legend. It was born in 1861 when German immigrant Edward Fronheim founded the Iron City Brewery. Although it began small, it would not take long for the brewery to move to a 4-story building. They were synonymous with Pittsburgh, and locals did everything to protect the brand. Prohibition kicked in, and breweries had to produce other things to survive. By the 70s, it was one of 40 breweries still left in the United States. In the 80s, they had a huge chunk of the regional beer market, and in 1995, the company was purchased. Innovations would be brought in, but it simply wasn't enough, and by 2005, the company filed bankruptcy. It was revived once again in 2007 with their iconic slogan, "The official beer of the Pittsburgh Nation." Iron City couldn't survive in the new market and moved out, and the site is now a historic landmark. Lucky Lager. Lucky Lager wasn't lucky after all. They were created to compete with European lagers, highlighting a traditional brewing process of using high-quality ingredients and lengthy lagering time. It had slogans like "Age Just Right" and "Slow Brewed Western Style" from Man-Sized Taste, and the simple but catchy slogan cemented the image as the best beer of the time. They became the first to display the brewing date on the can, paving the way for a brand new standard. By 1937, they became California's second best-selling beer, expanding across the United States in the 50s and producing over 2 million barrels annually. However, business mistakes and leadership changes led to a decline, and today it's remembered for its bold red X and unique taste. Jax Beer. Jax Beer was a victim of legal dramas. First brewed in Jacksonville, Florida, it was known for tangy, zestful, and smooth taste, but were also victims of a lawsuit in 1935. The company then closed in 1956, and the name was changed to Jackson Brewing. Years later, they closed and the recipe was sold. It continued the legacy until Pabst acquired the company in 1985, discontinuing the beer altogether. It then briefly returned in 2016 with a small batch that was brewed for testing, and it turned out that everybody had moved on. The comeback didn't materialize, and Jax is fondly remembered for its smooth taste and creative marketing. Narragansett. Although Narragansett has made a comeback, you'll be shocked to know how it disappeared. The once iconic New England lager was the region's largest brewery in 1914, and by the 50s it was everywhere. It had a cheerful message that read, "Hi neighbor, have a Gansett." The campaign became famous in New England, and when they brewed their 1 millionth barrel in 1959, every employee got a gold-plated bottle. It was a real golden moment. Things went south in 1965 when the company was purchased, and the government's antitrust suit lasted almost a decade. In 1983, the brewery then shut down, with the facility being demolished in 1998, leaving nothing but relics from the past. In 2005, Rhode Island brought it back to life, and it returned home in 2017 to the excitement of locals. Pearl Beer. Like Narragansett, Pearl is making a comeback. It's been over 20 years since they shut their doors. They were once a San Antonio staple, famous for their triple X symbol of fine craftsmanship. With a symbol of pride in Texas, the legacy was so deeply rooted that the brewery became a soda factory during Prohibition. They produced ice cream and offered auto repair services, ensuring that discontinued alcoholic beverages didn't mean the end of the company. They did eventually close down and the brand went to Pabst, and thanks to Oasis Brewing, it's made a comeback with a fresh citrus twist. As for the old site, it's now a hotel, named after the powerful woman who kept it alive through the tough times. Rainier. Rainier is one of the oldest brewing legacies in Seattle, but the journey was far from smooth. It began with an urban legend that the brewery had bribed state officials to rename a mountain after the beer. The story begins in 1854 when they opened up, and the company launched Rainier Beer, which soon became a local favorite. In 1888, they were sold and grew into one of the region's most recognized brews. But Prohibition would hit hard. In 1916, Washington had forced them to open up a California branch to keep brewing until nationwide Prohibition would force them to pivot. The brewery survived on non-alcoholic products, but the brand nearly faded to obscurity, and after Prohibition, they regained their place in Seattle. Rainier is remembered as an iconic Pacific Northwest beer. Knickerbocker beer. In the 1850s, New York City had a beer as iconic as the Empire State Building. Knickerbocker was the drink of the decade, named after Dutch settlers who wore funny Knickerbocker trousers. It captured the hearts of New Yorkers and spread across the country. For years, it became the drink of choice for millions of adults. But like many great things, the good times couldn't last forever. In the 70s, it was sold to larger companies, and then slowly faded from the market. There have been a few attempts at revival, but for now, it remains a classic memory in our hearts. Which of these vintage beer brands do you miss the most? And did you ever drink one? Let me know all about it in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another great memory in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.